It's psychologically necessary in order to get through what you have to endure.
When you don't know anything, you have to learn everything.
I guess I've been working with Jim Clemente too long, but I'm still sort of suspicious.
Hello and welcome to Best Case, Worst Case. This is your host, Jim Clemente, former New York City prosecutor, retired FBI profiler, and writer-producer on CBS's Criminal Minds. And with me today is...
Hi, everybody. It's Francie Hakes, former state and federal prosecutor. Hi, Jim. It's great to be back in the studio with you.
It is great. And it's also great to have our friend and colleague...
Maureen O'Connell. Hi, guys.
Hi, Maureen.
It's great to have you back, Maureen. And if I'm not mistaken, you were telling us a very amazing story. I mean, sad, but amazing story about a missing persons case that you became involved in. When we left off, you had just met a woman who was the mother of the missing person, and you were trying to determine whether or not the body that was recently found was actually her son.
Correct.
So, Maureen, this is one of the things I like most about doing this podcast with Jim, is giving our listeners behind police lines looks at what it is like for law enforcement, who are human beings, to work these kinds of cases. And I think it's important to understand that it's hard. It's hard to notify loved ones of a death. It's hard to sit and watch someone like that mother suffer because she's just lost her child. How do you do it? How do you get through it?
Well, it really doesn't leave you. You carry it with you forever. Here we are 24 years later, still feeling it.
I can tell that she's emotional about it. I feel emotional about it. I wasn't even there.
I know, and our listeners can't see this, but you might be able to hear it. But Maureen has tears in her eyes because this was a very, very difficult situation to be in. And obviously you have a tremendous amount of empathy for the mother and for the families.
For all the victims, yeah.
And we carry that around with us. I mean, it builds up over time. You know, you do develop a certain clinical detachment so you can get through this because you have to do your job. But you're still a human being, and it comes back and visits you late at night many times, doesn't it?
Yep. Well, I found the same as a prosecutor, especially doing child abuse cases. I would try to develop that clinical detachment. I was never all that successful at it, but I did hold off until the end. And so for me, when a trial would finish, I would go home to my husband and just collapse. And I would be just an emotional wreck for a while because of the horror that I had to not just look at, but talk about. And I think the pressure that I'm sure you all felt as law enforcement officers, I felt as a prosecutor, the pressure to get justice for the victims. And when on occasion you feel that justice isn't done, you feel like a complete failure. So there's a lot of this that's resting on your shoulders, not just looking into the face of the mother, but then making that arrest, making that case, building the case, prosecuting the case, and getting justice for victims is incredibly stressful.
It is. And it's, you have to really, really work hard to remain balanced and, laugh when you can and try to move to a state of gratitude for all the good things that are going on.
Yeah. I mean, it just reminds me of a couple of things. One, that law enforcement officers do engage in a lot of dark humor, and it's not disrespect, but it's psychologically necessary in order to get through what you have to endure. Because I've always said this, we see the worst that human beings do to one another. And it's just it's a horrible thing. And the other thing that it reminds me of is something that my mother used to say when we were little. It's just an old proverb about a little girl who cried because she didn't have new shoes until she met a girl who didn't have feet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a truism in life. We always think our problems are the worst. But man, there are people out there that suffer to such an extreme degree. And that's why we joined law enforcement.
Right.
We wanted to help people like that. And I wish that there weren't so many horrible things that happen to people. But I also wish that people understood that the vast majority of people in law enforcement are really there to help.
Absolutely.
Well, they really are. And going back to the situation that you found yourself in early in your career, as you said, in the previous episode, dealing with this mother who has probably just lost her son, I'm feeling very nervous thinking back over your story. You said that you had called your team to come to the apartment. I'm worried that someone is going to need to show her a photograph of this young man's body with his eyes gouged out so that he can be identified. And I'm really feeling kind of anxious about that because I'm hoping that was not required, because I can't imagine much more horrible than that.
All right. So what happened next was when I was out on the patio with the mom, she told me that this is her first time in Los Angeles in over 20 years. This is her first time out there visiting her son. And the last time she was here was when her brother went missing.
Oh, God.
He was a veteran who suffered from PTSD, and they have never found him. She had heard rumblings here and there in different parts of the country, but the last place she knew him to be for sure was Los Angeles, and she never found her brother again. And again, she collapsed. So I held her again, and I thought, dear God Almighty, this poor woman.
So let's talk about the search that you did of this apartment.
Sure. I separated from the mom and we did what we always do, which is we mark each room with a letter, A, B, C, D, F, G, all the way down. And we take very copious notes as to where we find any piece of evidence. You can do a cursory search initially to see what areas you might want to focus on or potentially have more agents look in this one area.
So where did you start?
His closet in the bedroom.
But wait, I'm confused. You've got a body,
Mhm.
obviously, that's been murdered because it's got a big knife in his chest. So there's a scene.
Mhm.
What are you looking for back in his apartment in particular that you think might help you?
Anything and everything. When you don't know anything, you have to learn everything. So we want to know who this person is, what makes him tick. Is there anything in there that could be viewed as a threat? We're obviously going to be looking at his phone records. We're running the whole gamut. And that's the open mind I have. That's the optic through which I'm looking at this entire situation. And so is Matt and the rest of the team. So I open up this closet and I see polo shirts going from lightest color to darkest color with even numbers of each color
Really?
perfectly lined up, separated. The hangers weren't overlapping. I mean, the
OCD
precision
much?
with which these shirts were hung, it would take us all day.
Wow.
Now, right away, just being the profiler that I am, I would think that person is very organized, possibly military background, because in the military, things are very structured. Or another place where people get a lot of structure is in mental institutions where they're given very specific daily routines. Is this guy from one of those backgrounds?
This guy was not in the military. And I decided at that point when I opened that closet that I was going to do a deep dive into his desk and all of his paperwork. I felt I might find something. I was looking for, back in those days, we all got paper phone bills and stuff. So I was looking for a number that showed up. What were the last numbers called? All that kind of stuff. And there was a pile of unopened mail. I went through the unopened mail. I started reading through all of his papers and documentation, and I came upon a journal. When I opened the journal, I started reading it, and it became clear to me that this person was having a really hard time in life. The mother had told me that her brother had mental illness, and I was beginning to suspect that her son may have had it also.
But Maureen, you didn't have any reason to suspect this was some kind of suicide.
No one thought it was a suicide at this point. But then I opened another drawer. I read all the way through his journal, and I took a bunch of notes. I called the case agent in and told him what I found. I said, I'm going to be doing a deeper dive, but I want you to know this is what I found so far, and I'm going to keep going. So keep going, I did. And then I opened another drawer, and I found a bunch of antidepressants, which I didn't know they were antidepressants. And back then, you didn't have Google, so we had to start asking each other. And, God help the poor agent that knew what the antidepressants were, because then, right, Jim, that started that, right?
Because then everybody suspected the
Yeah.
person knew because he was taking them.
Exactly. So then I went back out to the mom. I talked to her again for a few minutes, and then I talked to her about the antidepressants. And she said she did not know he was on antidepressants, but she suspected he might be. He was pulling away. He wasn't answering his phone. He wasn't calling her back, and she just felt a disconnect.
So you said earlier that he had a roommate. Did you get a chance to interview this roommate?
I did. I interviewed him quickly initially, and then because I had to deal with the mother, and then I went back and sat down with him.
So what did you find out from the roommate?
He didn't seem to care. He wasn't worried. He was like, hey, if he shows up, fine. If he doesn't, am I going to have to pay all the rent myself? And I thought,
Well, how old was this guy?
wow. In retrospect, I would say he was 24.
Okay, and so he was a roommate, didn't really have a long-standing relationship with the
Right.
victim?
It seemed to me, if my memory serves me correctly, they found each other like someone needed a roommate.
Right.
That's it.
Well, what did he say about where this guy was? When did he last see him? What's the window of opportunity here?
He said he hadn't seen him for a couple of days, that he's in and out, that they pass like two ships in the night. One works a lot in the evening. This person works in the morning, but he had not gone to work. And he knew he didn't go to work because work had called a house, and this is back before cell phones, where the victim's work called the home, and the roommate answered and said he's not here. He hasn't been here in a couple of days.
And did he say anything about taking medication, or
No.
did he say anything about altercations? Did he say anything about anybody who might want to hurt him?
No altercations. We obviously asked him about anyone. Who do you think could be threatening him, if anyone? He said, I have no information. He was nice. He's quiet. He didn't say was, because I would have keyed on that. But he said, he's nice. He's quiet. He's a peaceful roommate. He doesn't bother you. He's very clean, obviously. The way his shirts were is exactly how everything else he owned was kept.
Did he have a history of being hospitalized for mental health issues?
I don't think so. I think his taking antidepressants was, I want to say, about a year and a half.
Okay.
But his mom didn't know he was taking antidepressants.
No, she did not.
And did she have any information about his sort of habits or what he might be doing or where he might have gone?
She was completely in the dark. She lived in Ohio. He had recently moved out there within the last year, and she had never been here. She didn't even know what his apartment looked like until she got here.
So you talked to the mom, you talked to the roommate.
Did the search of the house?
We talked to people at work. We interviewed virtually everyone we thought that needed to be interviewed.
And was there any indication at all that somebody wanted to kill this guy, or that he was involved in some kind of nefarious activity that might end up in getting him killed?
Absolutely no indication whatsoever that he was involved in anything or had upset anyone.
And so did Matt, as the case agent, did he conclude this investigation?
Matt did conclude the investigation. When all the information was put together and examined by all the experts, the end result was shocking.
So what was the official investigative conclusion as to what happened here?
The official investigative conclusion was that he died of insanguination. He was stabbed in the chest, but the manner of death was suicide.
Wait.
Suicide?
What?
How do you get suicide out of that?
All the DNA on the knife was his. It was a knife that he owned. The fingerprints were his. The missing eyes, or the first call that came in that said his eyes were gouged out, that's what the person that came upon the body first told law enforcement. And it turned out that his eyes were not gouged out, that was actually animal and insect activity. One of the things I found amongst his paper was a long note that I thought could have been a suicide note, but I wasn't sure. And that's not my job. That would be the job of Jim's team, not me. I'm just collecting everything, collecting it properly, doing the best job I can, and handing it over to experts. So when all was said and done, that case was a suicide.
But why would he put his keys in his pocket, take a knife, and go to some, random wooded area and kill himself? He has an apartment.
Funny you should ask. Probably the most famous equivocal death case that I investigated, and I was an expert in equivocal deaths. That means a death in which you don't know whether the manner of death is homicide, suicide, accident, natural, or undetermined. And you do an investigation because there are one or more possibilities as to what the death was. But I investigated a case of an equivocal death at the highest level in the U.S. government, basically, the Vince Foster case. He was White House counsel during the Clinton administration, and he was found dead in the woods with a gunshot wound to his mouth and head. And many people ask that same exact question. But Vince provided us with the answer, because less than 2 months earlier, he had done the commencement address at the University of Arkansas Law School. And in it, not only did he mention death a number of times, and depression and darkness and clouds and stormy things, but he said, when life gets to be too much for you, take a walk alone in the woods.
Oh, goodness.
And that's the last thing he ever did in his life. He walked into the woods at Fort Marcy Park, and he took his life. He didn't want to do it at home where somebody else could find him. He asked his wife what she was going to be doing that day. And he was very stiff when he asked her. She later recounted. And she said, well, I'm just playing tennis this morning, and then I'll be back here. And I think he made an effort to do it in a place where somebody else would find him. And in both those cases, they were found by government people, right? It's on a government reservation. And
First
so
responders.
It becomes an FBI case, right? So in both cases, I think the crime scenes were handled fairly well. There were a lot of issues that people kind of tried to drive trucks through. But once we actually drilled down and found the details, which will be another one of the cases that I talk about when you decide to interview me again, Francie. But there are reasons why people will commit suicide out in the public. They don't want to be messy. They don't want somebody to have to come and clean it up. They might want to save their roommate or their parents from that discovery and so forth. So it can actually be kind of a caring thing when somebody does it like that.
Well, so Maureen, was this young man, did he commit suicide and then his mom arrived? Or at least that was your suspicion at that point, it was ruled a suicide. Or had she arrived and he just walked out and committed suicide while she was visiting?
He became a missing person, and his mom came out to help find him. And she came out very quickly based on what happened to her brother. She didn't want to waste a minute once she found out that his roommate said he hasn't been home. And the mom's like, what do you mean he hasn't been home? He didn't have a girlfriend. Where is he? I don't know. So that, coupled with all the information we found, the journals, the note, the interviews, it came back, believe it or not, as a suicide.
I just don't understand. I'm really blown away by the fact that someone first would commit suicide by stabbing themselves in the chest, but second, that any conclusions of an investigation would be that someone killed themselves by stabbing themselves in the chest. I mean, wouldn't it be much more common if you wanted to use a knife to slit your wrists or cut your jugular, or it just seems bizarre to me.
To cut your jugular, yes, you would bleed out, and you do it in several minutes.
How were you able to determine the actual identity of this victim?
There was a whole bunch of evidence that pointed toward his identity. One was the shirt that was the exact hue that would fit in the same color scheme of the shirts that he had in his closet.
So was there one shirt missing in this array, this rainbow array of colors?
There was one shirt missing. Most of them went from white to yellow to light blue. He didn't have a lot of really dark ones. He liked lighter shirts.
Okay, but there was a space. So each shirt was equally spaced in the closet?
Correct.
And there was one space missing?
Correct.
And the color shirt that the victim had on was the color that would have fit in that color array?
Correct. And in each of his drawers, you can imagine this, because I'm sure you're just as neat as this. But in each drawer, when you open it up, you could see the bottom of the drawer around each item. So there'd be a stack of jeans, and you could perfectly see the bottom of the drawer.
Everything was separated.
T-shirts.
I bet you when he ate his food, none of the food touched each other.
Well, I might confess that I don't like my food touching either, but I'm sadly not that neat in my closet.
Really interesting. Anyway, we'll go on from there. So you had the shirts. What else was used to identify him?
The acid-washed jeans, the same shoes that were missing. Everything was lined up and organized perfectly and beautifully. And there was a pair of shoes missing that were the same size and the same make. And from the photo I saw of the missing person, the body looked to be the same. The structure of the face seemed to be the same. And he had blonde curly hair.
It sounds like, though, there was absolutely no evidence of a struggle in his apartment, and there was no evidence of a struggle at the crime scene as well.
Correct. And additionally, the coroner said that the angle at which he was stabbed, so if you're going to stab someone, if you can imagine what that movement would look like, his was different. But there was something else very interesting. There was a mark. I cannot recall if it was
a hesitation mark.
A hesitation mark, yes.
Yeah.
So oftentimes when people cut themselves or kill themselves, they'll either shoot a part of their body first to see how much it hurts, which doesn't make any sense. You're going to blow your head off. I mean, what do you care how much it hurts? But people do care. And he had a hesitation mark on there. So he cut himself first to see how much it would hurt. And then he chose a different spot and pushed it in at an angle consistent with a suicide.
What a horrific way to commit suicide. And I don't think, having never stabbed anyone, I can't imagine what it's like, but I can't imagine that it's easy to drive a knife into your own chest like that.
I can't imagine, Francie, and it's just terrible for the family.
Well, I understand that was the conclusion of the investigation already, but, I guess I've been working with Jim Clemente too long, but I'm still sort of suspicious. There was just no evidence, in your expert opinion, of any kind of staging. This did not look staged to you.
No. Another reason, the only footprints going in and out of the scene were the victims, and from a totally different direction, the man that walked his dog in that area every day. It was actually his dog that ran up toward the body and wouldn't come back when the owner called him. And that's when the owner walked up close enough to see the victim.
Wow. This sounds like a terrible case. I'm wondering, Maureen, whether you categorize this as a best or a worst case.
Come on. It was the worst.
Why was it a worst case, Maureen? And how is it
Because it
affected
hurt.
today?
It seems like this was a personal case for you that you've never forgotten or really gotten over. Dealing with that poor woman who'd lost her brother and her son, it seems like more than anyone should have to bear.
She said, at least I know my brother could still be out there.
And so how did the case conclude? It's so unsatisfying, but that's just the end.
Well, it is unsatisfying because this one was different because I was able to talk to the case agent. 99 times out of 100, it may be a case agent from another division. It may be a bombing. It may be, I may be going to another country. I have no idea whatever happened. I actually found out about another case I worked right after 9/11 from listening to another podcast.
Really?
Yeah, about one of the FBI first responders who was talking about what happened in Los Angeles. And I was the ERT person that went in with the bomb guy on that case.
So if you weren't called to testify, then you had no reason to be given any information about the end of a case.
Correct.
But in this case, I have to go back to the beginning and say, I'm still blown away that you saw this guy's missing person poster and you intuited that you would be the one
Right.
that would have to have that very difficult job of informing the mother that her son was dead.
And I could have backed out. I know I could have.
Yeah,
and
you
Matt
actually-
said afterwards, Maureen, I am so glad you were there. And Matt's wife even said, thank God it was you and not Matt who had to tell that poor woman.
Well, thank you, Maureen, for telling us this obviously very emotional story. And again, the listeners probably wouldn't know this, but Maureen's eyes are filled with tears. This is still obviously bothering you. You couldn't speak when I asked you about it. And I understand that, and we won't push you any further, but we really want to thank you for coming in.
Thanks for calling me a crybaby on your podcast, Jim. Appreciate it. I'll have to return the favor sometime.
Yeah, those were not my words, but if that's what you want to interpret it as, okay. This is what we call dark humor.
Yep.
But
For sure.
It's a way that we survive. It's a way that we get through these very difficult and very emotional cases that we're sort of thrust into the middle of. And I think for you to have dealt with that right after you had your own baby and you were trying to be a good mother and trying to be a good FBI agent at the same time. And those two things can be very difficult together.
They really can. I just want to say thank you, Maureen, for two reasons. One, for sharing this incredibly emotional case with us and with our listeners, but also on a lighter note for helping me outnumber Jim Clemente. He's not under assault by anybody except for me generally. And so I appreciate having you here to keep him on the straight and narrow.
No problem. It keeps me on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, whatever.
Thank you, guys. And you know what? Thank you for all your years of prosecuting cases and putting really ugly people behind bars, getting them off the streets. And you too, Jim. I mean, you've worked amazing cases and done just really brilliant stuff. And you're a great ambassador for the FBI, so we're all appreciative for that.
Well, we're a team, the three of us, and
Three
many, many
musketeers.
more.
That's right.
For now, we'll be signing off for this episode of Best Case, Worst Case. Thank you for listening. Best Case, Worst Case is an XG production. Produced by Jim Clemente at Empire Studios, LA. Engineered and edited by Mike Thal. Music composed and performed by Simba Zumba. And hosted by Woman.
You can listen to Best Case, Worst Case on your favorite listening app. We are on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen to podcasts.
Knowledge is power, and when we know the facts about sexual abuse, we can better protect kids. Darkness to Light has already trained more than 1.4 million adults to keep children safe from sexual abuse.
I'm one of those 1.4 million, Jim. Using their Stewards of Children prevention training, they give you and gave me the facts, tools, and tips I needed to help keep the kids I love safe. And you can do the same with their Stewards of Children prevention training. Get trained today to prevent, recognize, and react responsibly to child abuse in your community.
Learn more about Darkness to Light and child sexual abuse prevention at www.d2l.org. That's D, the numeral 2, L.org.